Good evening. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and to those joining online via live stream on YouTube. Tonight, we're thrilled to present the 8th annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk, honoring Caroline Kent in conversation with Amanda Williams. My name is Shanta Lawson, and I am the Senior Director of Learning and Engagement at the Studio Museum in Harlem. On behalf of the entire Studio Museum staff, we thank you for joining us tonight. We're so grateful for the partnership of the Schomburg Center for hosting us today as we eagerly await the reopening of our new home in Harlem, which stands just a few blocks away from here on 125th Street. I want to give special thanks to Novella Ford, Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions, for her collaboration as we work toward this event. Thank you also to Brooke Jones for the AV and technical support, Steno Captions for providing CART captioning, Pro Bono ASL for providing American Sign Language interpretation, and to Anthony Artis and Ralston Smith for providing photography and videography this evening. There will be time for a few questions after the conversation, for which there are 2 microphones placed at the top of each aisle for our in-person audience. Those joining us on YouTube can place questions in the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to invite our incredible director and chief curator, Thelma Golden, to offer welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone here in the room and virtually with us. Thank you so much, Shanta. I'm so delighted to be gathered with you all tonight. We are endlessly grateful that you've joined us, and so appreciate your continued support and dedication to the museum as we approach an exciting new era in our institutional history. Of course, this night would not be possible without the generosity of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, one of our true institutional peers, really like family. I think of the Studio Museum and the Schomburg that have been in this geographic relationship, this intellectual relationship for so many years. And this would not be possible without my sister director, Joy Bivens. Joy, thank you so much. Thank you to Joy, to Novella, to the entire Schomburg team. You all know the Schomburg is getting ready to celebrate its centennial. Yes, its centennial. That's right. And I think we are all going to be privileged to live in the history that that moment will make. This program was created in honor of a cherished member of the Studio Museum family and a dear friend of mine, Lea K. Green. During Lea's time at the Studio Museum as Director of Special Projects, she and I formed an incredible bond that led to so much of the work that we continue to do at the museum. Her impact on me and everyone who knew her was profound. But for me, very personally, I continually marvel at the ways in which Lea's love for art and artists, for her sense of ingenuity, for her always willingness to take any risk with me, as long as we were sort of holding hands and doing it, and the way in which she believed so deeply in what we did remains a gift. When I think of the future we are having, I have so much gratitude for Lea for helping to envision the future we're about to embark on. Today, during the month of what would have been her 50th birthday, her memory remains strong. The Lea K. Green Artist Talk is a means of upholding so many of the values Lea believed in, including celebrating artists and cultivating community. I want to extend a very, very special thank you to Lea's family. Connie, Linny, Vivian, Wesley. Thank you all for being here with us tonight and for supporting Lea's legacy in such a passionate and meaningful way. Their support of the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund, which was started in 2016, makes this annual Artist Talk possible. We have had the immense pleasure of having and hearing from some incredible artists, including Carrie Mae Weems, Jordan Castile, Amy Sherrill, Dawood Bey, Hank Willis Thomas, Vanessa German, and Sanford Biggers, who was in conversation last year with Derek Fajor. And I think I saw Derek sneak in here this evening, but we all remember that talk last year. So thank you all. I want to thank the donors who have made the fund possible. But really, before I do any of that, I want to express my deep thanks to Amanda for agreeing to moderate tonight's conversation honoring Caroline, who we were pleased to award the Joyce Alexander Wien Prize in 2021. Through an expanded painting practice that includes sculpture, performance, and architecture, Caroline has masterfully created her own abstractive visual vocabulary as a means of exploring the limitations and possibilities of language. If you have seen her work, you will immediately recall the amazingly colorful, imaginative forms of geometry that she employed against often all monochromatic base. Through this unique and experimental approach to mark making, she has creatively redefined the modern canon of abstraction and given us an incredible artist legacy that we continue to see grow. Color plays a significant role in Amanda's practice, only one of the many ways that I think she and Caroline are in an artistic dialogue. Alongside architecture, which Amanda has exploded in incredible ways, Amanda yields color as a way of drawing attention to the complexities of race, place, and value in urban landscapes. Through site-specific installations, paintings, works on paper, and so much more, Amanda inspires new ways of looking at the familiar and documents the striking inequities of value assignment in built environments. Together, these two Chicago-based artists consider the intersections of architecture, form, language, and an embodied sensibility. I want to express my immense gratitude to those who've donated to the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund for the past 8 years, and to Shanta Lawson, who organized this beautiful gathering, and to the rest of the Studio Museum and Harlem team who make our work possible every day. Now I hope you will enjoy what I know will be an incredible conversation between these two fantastic artists. Please join me in welcoming Caroline, Kent, and Amanda Williams.
Thank you for those amazing words. I think we are speechless when we think about the heft of this institution, the magic of the Studio Museum of Harlem. We are so grateful to be here, and thank so many of you, including Joy, a fellow Chicagoan, for allowing us to share what we do all the time, which are these conversations with you all in a very public forum. I know that Caroline wants to make some thank yous as well.
Yes, thank you, Thelma, and thank you to Shanta Lawson for putting this together. And it was a lovely pleasure to meet Lea K. Green's family this evening. And I not only feel really honored, and it's very special to be here, but thinking about the model of, allowing space to be made for artists to come in, strangers, and to have a platform is a really special model, one that impacts me and makes me think about how legacy can be carried on in a really unique way. So thank you so much for having me.
Should we get to it?
Let's get to it.
So this is where Caroline and I live. No, this is, there's just two ladies from the Midwest. So this is what most people think of Midwestern landscape. And most people know Caroline and I to be Chicago-based artists. I am from Chicago, but Caroline is actually from Sterling, Illinois, which is a little bit west. Mm-hmm. I said central, and she said that's not correct. West, it is the hardware capital of the world, if anybody needs to know, and is about 14,000 people in population. But I wanted you to begin and tell us a little bit about how your family got to Sterling, and then also your connection This is actually very familiar to both of us. We spent a lot of time in cars traveling to visit family. You would go to see your grandmother in Rockford, but maybe tell us a little bit about how your family landed here.
Yeah, so my father's family is originally from Mississippi, and so like many families in the Great Migration, found their way up to Illinois. And so my father grew up in Rockford, and my mother, I feel like her family, there was a Hispanic, my mother's Mexican, and there's a large Hispanic migration as well. And a lot of Hispanic families found their way to places where there was industry. And so in Sterling, Illinois, there was a steel mill that brought in a lot of families. My parents met and decided to move to Sterling. They thought it would be, you know, a small, quaint town to raise a family. So that's how we ended up there.
And maybe talk a little bit, this is your childhood home.
It is.
So maybe talk a little bit about some of the values that still pervade your life and your work that kind of came to be in these walls and doors.
Yeah, it was a small town. Growing up in a small town, your laughter. We grew up 4 daughters in the family, so 4 girls and my parents, all in that small little home. We were all in very close proximity. And I grew up seeing my mother, she was kind of a very traditional kind of homemaker. I saw a lot of canning, sewing, and I think like this image actually here shows my twin sister and I, Christine, in cheerleading outfits. It was middle school, and one of the things that I think about often is that my mother, who actually sewed the skirts for our cheerleading outfits, she was always at the kitchen table sewing. And my father, who was an accountant by day, I saw him building an addition onto the home. So I saw my parents often very busy with their hands, making, doing, and it was without discussion. It was just what happened. And so some of those things, I think, really imbued themselves on me later. And it was, you know, rural town, so you're outside a lot of the time, or else we had what is called a make and do book, like a craft book.
Make and do.
It was called Make and Do, part of a children's encyclopedia back when people sold those door to door. And so we would make crafts a lot of the time and make stuff. And so that comes out of that.
So talk a little bit, these are works that you made later on, but we had this great conversation about that kind of ethos of making that was pervasive in the household, but also some of the jobs you had, some of the things that you did that were part of a larger, what you feel is kind of an ethic of work and hard work that comes from a kind of Midwestern background, and the Midwest is actually associated with quite
That is
often.
true. So that first image of the landscape, there's something about that expansive landscape that really left this impression on me. We would drive often to Rockford, Illinois to see my grandmother, my dad's mother. And on those rides, you know, there's music playing in the car, but it's the soundtrack to the landscape I often found. And that landscape I have an even more direct relationship to, because one of my first summer jobs when I was 14 was corn detasseling. And if you're from, you know, the Midwest, or if you're from like Iowa, you know exactly what that is. But for those of you who don't, you are in the cornfield up at 6 a.m. and you are with a team of other young people, and you are pulling the tassel out of the top of the corn as you go down these long rows, and it's brutal. But you know, that kind of job affords a young person, you know, a large sum of money and experience. And I remember my father saying, if you can do this, you can do anything. And I think I believed him. I thought it was true. I thought, oh, okay, maybe this is the gateway to like become anything. And I think in some small way, I think that kind of stayed with me throughout that drive, that kind of consistency of doing a thing. You might not love it, but you do it. And yeah, I feel like there's ways that it has translated into making.
You still corn detassel?
No.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about how that then translates into college. So you went to Illinois State, which is still very much a kind of central Illinois, but that kind of ethos of hard work, and still within these kind of Midwestern landscapes where you're seeing still this confluence of industry and kind of blue collar at the time, but kind of everyone has an ethic of work and hard work and works in these ways. And then we've talked often about how sports and how these other elements can continue kind of fostering a lot of those metaphors and those drives. And so maybe talk a little bit about the specialness of Illinois State as a place for you. These are great images of you running track. The 600 meter is not a joke.
No.
It's not a sprint. It's not a marathon. It's actually one of the hardest races to run. So maybe talk a little bit about how that starts to segue into your thinking as you're basically at that point finding this pathway to art and not realizing that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I did not have an inclination to be an artist as a child. I definitely was creative and maybe had this curiosity about the world. But like detasseling, you know, having this thing you do that's shaping you in ways that you don't even know it's producing tools in you that you will use later. I ran track since middle school all the way up to the age of 21, 22. And it was a long time of running. And in my young adult life, it felt very big in my life. And there were a lot of things that it birthed in me. And I didn't always like it, but it was like, I felt like the two images on the screen kind of describe, there's at times you need some grit, and there are other times it's just like steady focus. And a lot of mentors along the way. But why I think it's important is thinking about consistency and doing a thing for long periods of time. And it can be very solo as well. And I think that being an artist is something that when one chooses to do it, there are moments where that will seem like you need some grit to push through the toughness. I think that's something we don't talk about enough publicly. Like, it is hard to be an artist. It is hard to have this kind of lonely race at times where you're running on your own. You're in your studio by yourself. There isn't always going to be validation. There isn't always going to be someone saying, you should keep doing this, you know? You should, you know, the continuing of a thing. And so I think about that a lot, and I thought about it a lot over the years of being an artist. I've gone back to thinking about what I learned then to think about now in the studio.
My best friend in college, I studied architecture, and my best friend was a track star. She doesn't like it when I say that, but she too was a 400-meter runner. And I just remember we were in a field that requires so much commitment and dedication, but she was doing the secondary thing. And so there's like an elevated level of having to love both of these things at the same time. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about what that moment was where you sort of realized that art might be the pathway that you wanted. And then also, how do you juggle that commitment? Anybody that's played a sport at a top level knows the practices. It is isolating, but the meets, the travel, like how do you bridge that, and how do you make some of those connections?
That's a great question. I think I found art in college. I found painting. And I think that was a great way to kind of leave the cloak of athleticism and to be this other person, to have a different identity, to explore something else. And I think being an athlete can feel very much like a label. And it's the one way people might know you. And being an artist was a really fascinating way to develop my inner life and inner curiosities and to ask certain kinds of questions. So I found solace in switching my major late in the game when I was a junior in college to art. And that's when I met my first Black female art teacher, which was really exciting.
And who was an abstractionist, right? Jacqueline was an abstractionist.
Jacqueline Richards was my professor. I knew she was a painter. But back then, it was the 90s. You couldn't just Google someone. You couldn't like secretly stalk your teacher and like look them up. So I knew she was a painter. And I wanted to bring her up tonight because I feel that Jacqueline represented a Black woman in the Midwest. She was from Wisconsin. And a little bit of sadness in that I only had her for 2 weeks, but I do remember I had a notebook and it was filled with notes on how to properly mix the paint with linseed oil, and I was learning oil painting for the first time from her. Unfortunately, after 2 weeks, Jacqueline became sick and I didn't know. I had a grad student that ended up teaching the class, and after that, I didn't hear what happened to her until years later when I was invited back to Illinois State. I had found that she had passed away, and that's why I never saw her again. And I didn't, in those 2 weeks, I didn't have enough time, but when I went back to Illinois State, I saw a painting she'd made. They had pulled out from the archive, and it was an abstract painting. It had wood. It was like a diptych that had wood, and then there was paint on this side. And it was strange because it even resembled a kind of a form that I present some of my work in. And I thought, this is so interesting that somehow Jacqueline we've been influenced in a similar way, or she's coming back in my life. And she's intrigued me and stayed with me. And so I hope to I hope to pull her life out of a little bit of the shadows and bring her out more. So.
She's with us. She's with us.
Jacqueline.
Maybe also then talk a little bit about, before we segue into your time as a teacher, maybe talk about others who have influenced you or you sort of feel like have been indirect or direct mentors or teachers.
So when I went on to college, when I went on to grad school, I did have this professor. So at that time—
And where was grad school?
So grad school was at the University of Minnesota. I was living in Minneapolis at the time, and I knew I wanted to go to grad school and really, commit myself to being an artist. I took 7 years off from undergrad to grad school, so that's a long time. And that doesn't happen, I feel, with artists in New York. I feel like artists, right as soon as they get out of grad school, there's a path, there's a gallery, there's a lot of pressure and things. And I think being in the Midwest, in a context where things happen in a different temporal sense, time was a lot slower. So I took that time to kind of discover more things about life and myself. And when I got to the University of Minnesota, I met Clarence Morgan, who was, for me, I had grown up with a black father, and he's an anomaly in many ways. There's things that he does that are very unconventional, I felt. And so he was an interesting model. But when I met Clarence Morgan, who is a black man and an abstract painter, I was really, really curious. This must be a rare thing. And I found it was a really kind of serendipitous moment that I got to study under him, as well as another professor, David Feinberg, was really wonderful there. But seeing the model of Clarence and having a professor where you can say, where are the other people that look like us, that that want to work in abstraction? Where are they? And having a mentor through that was super unique and super great to find that in the Midwest.
So take us back to this photograph. So this is actually before you go to graduate school. So you teach for a while in the Peace Corps, is that right?
Yes. So my twin sister and I both decided to kind of leave the country and to join the Peace Corps. This desire to kind of leave and go out and help others, I feel like that's something that was generated in our community growing up. It was like, that's what you do. And maybe I saw it modeled in home. You help out people. And I think we were both interested in kind of going out into the world and having an experience that wasn't completely solely just for us, but maybe we can make an impact somewhere. And so I was sent to the country of Romania, a small Eastern European country, and then more specifically in Transylvania, Alba Iulia. And this is a picture of with some fifth graders. I was teaching English there for 2 years. And so I found it to be a really kind of pinnacle moment, because up until this point, the way that I traveled as a young person was through film, television, these kinds of experiences. Most of our family vacations were just to Rockford and back. They were not abroad. They were not any further than that.
You have spring break in the Caribbean?
No.
Okay.
I wished. So this was a big experience to go to another country, to learn the language, and to the contrast of growing up in the Midwest, where most houses are very banal colors of cream, brown, gray, safe colors. To go to a very painterly landscape, in my opinion, was kind of like shocking and alluring and world-changing for me. It was a complete paradigm shift to see the kinds of things that I saw, and to be grappling with learning new people, new language, new ways of being, all of that.
Well, talk a little bit more about language, because I think this is going to be pivotal to when we look at some of the work later on. So this moment where you are in Romania, you have to learn speech, you have to learn language, but then these are other languages that you feel like you're starting to absorb. Maybe talk a little bit about how that's tying back, or were you aware at that time that it's tying back to those memories you have of those foreign films that you watched with your grandmother, or even different, I don't know if your mother spoke Spanish in the home, or this way that language has always kind of been present.
Yeah, no, thank you. My mother did speak Spanish, but it was with relatives, not in the home as much, but I was aware there was another language happening in the home. And I didn't learn it then, but I felt like I learned Spanish later in life when my curiosity for language began to develop and get even stronger. But Romania became this place where I started to become really aware of how learning a language involves more than just listening. It comes with like looking for cues and clues within the landscape, within the environment. I really did feel inside of a foreign language film, international film. And I had watched many films prior to that. So being on the inside was super unique. And so I became very aware of not only this painterly landscape, but how these forms and shapes, where the cuts are, where the gaps, where the shifts. And I think that in trying to understand my experience, I kind of grabbed on to all these different elements, and they began to converge. And so in grad school, it kind of coalesced to dealing with all these ideas of how there is this kind of abstraction that happens when you are in a new location. Things are illegible to you that you don't know how to interpret them. There is no direct translation. So I found myself a lot of times when I grappled with language, I was really curious to see like what comes up in that space and what I grab onto. And is it a form? Is it a shape? Is it a gesture? You know, those kinds of things.
So, you know, you had me at color, but I want you to talk a little bit more about, you know, there's so many things that you could attach to an idea about a kind of illegibility of something that you then seek out to make sense of. So I default obviously always to architecture, but there's food, there's music. So what do you think it was about these particular environments that made you fall so much in love with the architecture? Was it the color in comparison to sort of like this Midwestern landscape, or, you know, why wasn't it the food, or why do you feel it really was architecture that you sort of locked into?
That's a great question. I mean, definitely the music was impactful, and eating and people and experiences. But I think it was my early exposure to certain artists, like with form. I think I think there were visual artists, Robert Motherwell, Ellsworth Kelly. I think that having the experience of seeing that kind of those art precedents, that when I'm here, things start to speak to me, that I'm already intrigued by. It just hasn't all come together. And I mean, there are many artists that I feel have influenced me in my practice. And then there are lesser known ones that are kind of quieter, I say, like Atal Adnan, who is like directly looking at landscapes and thinking about landscape in this very consistent and repetitive manner, like a meditation. Carmen Herrera with her large geometries. So I think like there's something about seeing those kinds of visual languages and then seeing these architectures in the landscape that are all starting to point me toward kind of a language of my own.
So these are some works from grad school. So this is this immediately after you've come back from Romania? This is a few years, or give us a sense of the time of when this starts to come.
Yeah, so in grad school, I think, you know, when you're in grad school, I think there's a time when you kind of dance around things, ideas you have, and I didn't want to look at Romania so directly. I thought I could get away with like dancing around that experience and kind of borrowing from different moments. And I think finally when it was time for my thesis exhibition, I wanted to deal with it directly. So some of these are large wooden canvases that hang up on the wall. And I think this was my first attempt at trying to think about this, bringing together architecture with language, in the voice of abstraction, and having it embody experience, like painting historically does. And so, yeah, that's where my focus was at that time.
And these are also works that look,
So this is
look
much
closer
later.
to what, yes, but
And
go ahead. Go.
I was going to say, like, time. Like, I took 7 years off in between undergrad and grad school. And then from that last image in 2008 grad school to this image in, like, 2014, I think time comes up again.
And these are works on paper, though,
They are.
that start to come about as you make a shift. You're also making a geographical shift. So,
That's correct.
right? So tell us a little bit about, like, what's the context of when these works are starting to be made? Because this is, to me, the beginning of when we start to see the work that people feel like they most know you for. So
Yes.
this is the edge of it. So maybe start talking about what feels like a leap. So what else is happening between these works on wood, on walls, and these are on paper, but they start to move back onto the canvas?
I think a lot has happened. I think not only has there been a lot of time, but there's a lot of time to think. There's a lot of time to play. There's time to question. And I think at this time, I remember I had just had my first child. I have 3 children. I have an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, and a stepdaughter who's 18. So at this time, yes, I was busy, but I also remember thinking, okay, what kind of challenges can I give myself to keep myself active and questioning? So I started making these works on paper, and I'm settled. I'm in Minneapolis at this time. So I'm still in the Midwest, but I am living in Minneapolis post-grad school. And
You've just had the baby, or you are pregnant?
yeah, I think I've just had him. And he was such a good baby that I was like, what else can I do? No.
Well, that's
What else can I put on my plate?
I was telling somebody, Caroline and I's conversations go like this. I have 12 minutes. Can I call you? I'm
Yes.
like, yes, I'm in Carline. And she's like, okay, I'll make this brief and we'll talk about it again later. So like there's a way that we understand time because we just are in the same moment of caring for other humans that necessitates a kind of different relationship to time. So I've always appreciated that we don't necessarily have that carry directly into the content of the work that we're making, but
Right.
there's a very particular kind of aptitude that's necessary to shut on and off creativity in segments that go between
So
breastfeeding or Carline or
Yeah.
whatever it is. So I was always struck when you were describing that at that moment you were making these works on paper and you were making a kind of large volume, and I feel like I had a parallel moment where it was like, okay, I've got to create, and so what is that joy? It wasn't necessarily like, I've got to keep making work because I'm an artist and I need to make work. You know, it was like,
Right.
what's this way of other joy that comes from a moment? My oldest daughter was also a very good baby, so we lucked out on these first children that really did allow a kind of.
We're not going to talk about the second. No, I'm joking.
In case they're listening, we love you. If they're listening, we love you so much. No, but no, because you sort of. I mean, I don't know how you were, but I was like, this is easy. I don't know what these people are talking about. I mean, she's right there. I can just sketch a little bit.
That's exactly what I
Making some
thought.
collages. You know,
my
like
goodness.
she's right there. So I really appreciate that these are where you're working things out, not knowing that they become the precursor for
That's right.
kind of these next sets of
Yes.
works.
That is absolutely true. And it is interesting, like time is very different. It's like time was like long periods of time, and then you have a child and it's like short amount of time. What can I do? What can I do in 12 minutes? Sometimes I would be like, just give me 30 minutes and I can get this thing done. Like I just needed, I became very efficient with time, just like you say.
But these forms, I mean, I'm gonna skip so we can see the kind of beginnings of the works that most excite everybody about what you do. But there's a whimsy in the ones that come before, and for me, it feels like those are like gibberish almost, like la 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 la, like you're just like singing or like feeling good, like something's coming out. And these are starting to be a syntax where we have to work to understand what's happening, and then there's a story happening or there's something that might be going on. And so maybe talk a little bit about the refinement of some of those forms, or that symbology that's either secret for you or really has meaning, but the viewer really has to kind of work to start to understand?
You know, I think about this moment when I walked into the Wiseman Art Museum, which is on the University of Minnesota campus, and I remember walking in and seeing one of Robert Motherwell's large Elegy to the Spanish Republic paintings. It was a large abstract expressionist painting. It had maybe 3 colors in the palette. And I remember how impactful that felt, seeing that painting. And I remember thinking, like, how did he do that? Like, this language is it universal? Like, how did he know that I would feel this way? How did he make me feel this way and think this way and spend time really studying this image? And so I think that was so captivating. Almost, it was provocative, because I was thinking, like, how do I do that? How can form be, in his sense, commanding? And how can form do these different things? And so I felt this kind of desire to try to figure out, how can I make a language that relies heavily on these kinds of geometric forms that lie in between recognizable geometries and maybe new geometries. What can I do and what can I say? And I think that kind of started me off on this journey to figure this out. So when you talk about the works on paper that feel like maybe gibberish, I think there was a sense of freedom with those that I didn't spend a lot of time thinking. I kind of felt myself through them, and it's not that it was feeling, it was based on all these experiences I had had up until that moment, things I've seen, things, when I would see different architectures, and I'd also cut shapes out of paper. So I'm having kind of 2 things going on at the same time. But I felt like the larger paintings, so these paintings are about 9 feet tall and 7 feet wide. And I started making these when I had my second child. Remember when the first one was easy? Okay, well, the second one, no, she was kind of easy as well. She was fine. But I knew, Nina's great. I knew that I wanted to translate some of these smaller things into larger compositions. I wanted to think about them as like, I want to assemble these paintings in a unique kind of way. And so that's how this started off, this kind of moving from a lot of the works on paper to building these larger compositions. I think there was a built-in challenge, moving in scale from one size to the other. Yes, it's like a kind of like figuring out a kind of choreography in that space, but one that I felt really compelled based on looking at a lot of other painters over time, and painters that work nothing like I do. I think I look at a lot of painting that looks nothing, that isn't even just abstraction. Gwendolyn Knight is an old favorite, and I like her paintings are soft, and they kind of border between some of the representational imagery starts to become abstract. And so I think all those different influences kind of would move in and be like, somehow they're getting integrated in my psyche as I'm producing these. And I'm thinking, I'm heavily thinking about like how to create these kind of compositions that not only are balanced, but how do I throw that balance off and how do I compensate? So I think like going back to this, the conversation earlier about what happens in the space of the grapple of learning a new language. What do you grab onto? I encountered that time and time again with figuring out that space in the painting.
I mean, there's always an edge of legibility, or it's almost there. I find myself constantly, your palette of marks, right? So, and when you get really close on these, the variations on the textures as well, so that there's, it hovers over like, is this a landscape? Is that a form? Is that a this? Is that a that? And I feel like I go from each one trying to find those components that might like complete the whole story, or, always, these kinds of really strong values and contrast, but really trying to get to, what might be told. And so maybe talk a little bit also about your titles in a way that helps at least for me, that's my first go-to often, to kind of have clues about what else I'm searching for when I'm really engaging the work.
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me about the title of this, because titles, because I make up so many of the titles, they just are not readily available in my mind. I can't just like say, oh, I remember that, that's da-da-da-da. I don't, limited amount of space for...
Caroline, what are you saying to me? I'm like hanging on these titles.
No, the titles are, okay, but the titles are very, like, some are poetic, but I do spend time really trying to find the right words to describe something, and they're usually like aspects of temporality that can't possibly coexist at the same time, or there's a way that I like to fold in a little bit of science fiction and thinking about other paradigms, other kind of realities. You know, time in a lot of these paintings becomes a bit distilled because you are dealing with so many strong forms of geometry, and then amidst a black ground, and that there is a kind of, I think, a quietude I'm after, even though there's such a strong presence. I remember distinctly thinking about the challenges of history and abstract painters, you know, definitely wanting to present work that was very much commanding attention of a space or a room. And I thought, I'm attracted to the scale, but I don't know if I want the same, I don't know if I have the same intention, or I don't know if I want to be able to work at a large scale, but how can I balance that without it feeling so in charge of the whole space? I want there to be a kind of warmth, and I think that my palette is often trying to find that warmth and trying to soften the experience to be alluring. And so, but to go back to the titles, I'm also inspired a lot by the literary, and so some of them are quite dramatic. Some people think I'm dramatic, but I'm not. I'm actually mostly serious most of the time.
All of the time.
But I try to lighten up a little bit, like in moments like this. But yes, the titles are dramatic, and I think it allows me a space in the practice to bring in elements of drama, theater,
Film.
and film.
So Raymond Son is one of my heroes, and he has dual works up right now, and I was able to see works at David Zwirner yesterday. And so somewhere in there was this quote he was having about loving the black as the background because you don't have to fill it. It provides the kind of energy for you. And I was like, yes, yes. And so this one in particular makes me feel that way also, in terms of like that interplay of not, it's not needing to worry about, but if you have a white background or a lighter background, that there's the eye needs it to be grounded unless you want it to be floating. And there's a way that black as a background doesn't always have to do that for you. So for me, I want to also then segue into when you start to use other things as that background. There's one more we're going to see, right? But when you move into more explicit uses of the environment, I think it's surprising to some people, but I think in your mind this entire time, these are kinds of not only performative, but they're also spatial, or they're bringing some of these ideas from the canvas into the space. So maybe talk about that movement into larger spaces and these kinds of introductions of some of these forms in 3 dimensions.
I knew I loved painting. I love the canvas. I like the tooth of the canvas, that surface that kind of grabs the paint when you drag the brush across it. There's so many things about painting that are really satisfying. I mean, and I feel like painters especially talk about painting in this way that's a bit much.
Like, and then
it's a bit much. It's a lot. And they're all in. That's great. I knew that I wanted more things to do. And this goes back to like working with my hands. Like, I knew there were other things that wanted to happen in the space. And I also was, I also just thought, as an artist, there are just other things I like doing. So I wanted to figure out a way, like, how can I make sense of doing things in relationship to painting when the painting has this agency, it wants to move outside of the borders of the canvas into the room. And so it was exciting to kind of bring some of these shapes or forms out of the canvas, bring them into the space, and think about how that's changing the experience. And all of a sudden, it goes from being an isolated image to an environment that's starting to shift and change. And as I'm discovering this, it's exciting. And I'm thinking, okay, now that I'm bringing objects into the space that start from the wall, that kind of move to the floor, what would it mean to bring bodies in? And so I had a couple times when I was able to work with, in this image, working with this small dance troupe in Omaha, Nebraska. Super exciting having that come about. And working with this team and thinking of it as an act of translation to move from one language that's visual into another language that's bodily. And thinking, it was great. I remember working with the woman who was in charge of the team. She was so excited to think about language and to think about translating that. And so that was a really interesting moment. And I think it's also one that, with another performance I had, where there are two women in the space, and it's even smaller. And I am really drawn. I'm not drawn to the epic. I'm actually much more drawn to these smaller moments that can happen. I like the simplicity of the color black. I think it has, built into it, there is a profundity to it that is really deeply embedded in our psyche, I think, that's spatial, it's spiritual, it's grounding, it's levitating, it's all these different things. And I think with the performance, I knew that I don't need to do too much. I think there's something that can be really powerful in a kind of simplicity, and that's, that happens sometimes in the paintings, and sometimes they're really complex. It doesn't, but I like to kind of go in between saying a lot in the painting or saying very little, and how I can get these things kind of concentrated. So.
And that's more from that same performance. So there's performance and there's also collaboration. So this is your exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 2021 to...
You tell me.
Pandemic something.
Yes, yeah, it was a little post.
And so there's obviously, the command of the architecture down to the selection of the carpet color and starting to make these impressions into the wall, but then also these wooden pieces. So maybe talk a little bit about your collaborator. Well,
with this work specifically, what was exciting for me was this way to think about this language and how it can potentially operate from one exhibition to the next. And specifically for this exhibition, I felt compelled to create a framework to work through, to produce the work. And that framework was a fictional narrative about these two identical twins that live apart. They live in distant, spaces, time and dimension, and how they might communicate to each other through objects in their home and in their space. And that was exciting because I could draw on my own experiences as an identical twin. There have been times when people get it confused and they think this is about that relationship, and it's not. I love the space of fiction. Why reality when the fiction can be so much more elaborated, and you can elaborate on it when it can be so much more grandiose or subtle. So this was a really unique opportunity to kind of play in this space. And there were 2 rooms in the exhibition, so there was this kind of communicating across rooms. And there was a bookshelf with these books that had stretched linen over them, where I had painted these shapes on the cover that were really satisfying because I always had this desire to make science fiction book covers, from the 60s and 70s, because typically those book covers always have really simple images of a shadowy figure and a moon or 3 suns. And then a lot of times they're against these black grounds because it's outer space or otherworldly. And so this was my opportunity to do that. And I think that's probably the most satisfying thing, is when you can find a way to do the thing that you love and have it make sense within the larger context of your practice. And I'll also say there was in this a beautiful writing desk that,
Do we have a picture of it?
I don't know if it's in that image. It's not in that, but for that exhibition, I did collaborate with my husband, who is also an artist, Nate. He didn't make these ones, the ones in the image, but there was a writing room, and in an exquisite, like, wooden desk that he made. And I think there's something to be said about having space in the Midwest to have a wood shop and to make, and that we work so closely in proximity. Our studios are in our home, and so having, you know, I didn't need to take it to someone else and say, you know, make this thing for me. It was more like I told him, I'm like, I really want a desk for this, and I need it to look like. He's like, no, I got it. I already know how you think. I know how you're processing all this, and so it was great. And that kind of collaboration, where we've been doing more things as of late, but that's also like a really special kind of relationship we have because we're both artists, and we sometimes might show up in each other's work in interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite collaborations with architecture.
Yeah.
No, this is a show you had at Patron Gallery a few years ago. And this is when I acquired my first Caroline Kent piece. I was so excited. I was coming expecting more of the syntax of the characters. And so I quite honestly was like blown away that there's architecture and that you're drawing on the wall. And I'm like, she's one of us. She's one of us. And so maybe, so maybe talk a little bit about, I mean, this is very explicitly then about your interest in architecture, what the sources are, and what you don't have to be explicit if you don't want to, but really kind of understanding how they too become, these floor plans become this language for you, and this interplay between that and these other elements of the work that then, again, are telling this kind of larger spatial story.
So I really wanted to think about how this abstract painting language could sit in conversation with the ideas around theater. And so I really liked these beautiful renderings in this Mexican modernist homes book I had. And so these floor plans were actually hand-drawn in the book. And I started thinking of these homes as like set design. Like those homes, I didn't imagine myself in them. They were too luxurious. I thought of myself as an actor in that space. And I thought about how the floor plan then becomes a set design for like everyday life. You're moving in and around this. You're going through doorways, down a corridor, out into the yard, and I thought about like how that space becomes very theatrical. And so if we've got theater and set design in the form of an architectural drawing, then what is then performed in that space and what is spoken or acted, and that's where the abstractions and the language come in, and thinking about what that might be translated to in that scenario.
And so how do you think, you know, so there's still this materiality is there, but then there's, in your mind, big translations between, like, say, a body of work like this, and then when you move into different kinds of planes or proximities in relationship to the scale of the wood and the impressions, and then the works on linen, the painted work. So maybe talk also, this is more recent work.
It is. I think, too, the switch to linen was, as much as I love working in the black site, I also was like, there's a way that this language operates quite differently against a different kind of context, and the linen provided that. And moving in these different materials and going into the wood. I mean, you and I talked earlier today about the impressions and what that means. You know, I had these large cutouts into the wall at the MCA at that exhibition, but then I'm moving toward another exhibition where they kind of come back in. And I think it goes back to this moment of thinking about all these things that have impressed themselves on me as I've moved through the world. You know, I move through cities and I move through new experiences, not unlike being on this stage here and just thinking about all, you know, the receding stairs as they go up. I think about all the ways that environments, architecture, people, places, moments impress upon me. And I think the impression is a way to kind of mark back into the landscape, into the environment, and to speak back to it in a kind of profound way of form and scale and subtlety.
So this is your most recent show at Casey Kaplan Gallery. So you did that in large form here, where these are kind of pressing in, but then you also had those components where things were standing out. So to me, this becomes kind of like this full circle moment of kind of all of these elements that are then in proximity with these works.
Sounds right to me.
Is that correct? Am I correct? I just think it's so exciting. Somebody that trained and was sort of like hammered into the way you have to think about environment and context. It's just so rewarding for me to see you move through a process of like thinking through architecture and form in a way that really takes ownership of like how it's going to be your language, so that, you know, it's always so exciting when somebody's like, oh, that's a Caroline Kent, right? So it's powerful that can happen with these forms that you've come through this very long journey through language, of materiality, of color, of form, in a way that's, you know, distinctly your own. I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about before we invite some friends to ask some questions.
I'll say one other thing, like, and you must, this is like, I'm thinking like you must think this too. When I drive through Chicago, smaller neighborhoods, I'm so aware of the architecture, and there's so much of it that seems so hidden, probably to most people most days, but now that I'm looking so much these days, like what is happening around the doorways of buildings, next to windows, there's just so much visual interest that happens in Chicago, in that city. And I think, I'm like, how do you even drive without getting distracted?
No, I just pull over all the time. So even yesterday I was walking and I had to double back and like needed to catch the scene at the right moment. So I'm like standing in the middle of the street on 126th Street. And I was like, this isn't Chicago. I'm gonna get jacked. So let me get out of the street. I'll take this picture. But yeah, I mean, that's how my mind works all the time. But I think that's a very particular kind of strange sorority that is architecture. So I'm glad that you belong to that.
Yeah.
If there are any questions, there are microphones at the back if people would like to step to the mic.
Good evening. I'm also an RPCV, so I'm really excited to meet another Return Peace Corps volunteer in the art world. That always makes me very happy.
Very cool.
I was curious about a small mention you made about language, and particularly your mother's language coming back to you later and having to learn Spanish later. Mm-hmm. I also was born with Spanish as my first language, but I didn't learn it actually really until I was in Ecuador. But I had so many memories of the language when I began to actually learn it and speak it in regular practice. And I'm curious about how that influenced your art and how you still use Spanish. I know in Chicago there's a huge Mexican population, so I'm just curious about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your question. I live in Humboldt Park. It is a large Puerto Rican neighborhood. It's changing a little bit, but for the most part, there's a lot of opportunities to speak Spanish there. But Spanish, you know, when I was living in Minneapolis at the time, I think I had this desire to connect with other people, and I had a few friends that did not speak English. And so this really put me in a situation to have to really grab onto Spanish and learn it, finally. You know, at home, I could get away with making jokes and saying things, you know, here and there with my mother, but it wasn't until I started really learning it that I was like, oh, I had a lot of aha moments like you're talking about, like, oh, that's what that means, and that's why that's said like that. And then it also helps when you hear it said by other people that aren't your mother, you know? You're hearing it outside the home, and you're hearing it in a larger context. And so it's great. It comes back. But I think to answer your question about language, what I realized is that when I learned Romanian, that's when I learned Spanish well enough, but then I really learned, in the Peace Corps, as you know, the language training is really good. And really learning Romanian really helped illuminate so many things. I was 25 at the time learning a new language, not easy. It was like, well, I wish I'd learned this when I was little. But it was really good at helping me understand that there is this moment when things go from being very opaque to being illuminated. Things that you're like, I have no idea, now I know exactly. And that kind of, even before I went to the Peace Corps, I remember meeting with a Romanian friend who I remember thinking, I'm gonna understand what he says. This is so strange. Is this really gonna happen? Will it happen? And then when it does, there's such a kind of interesting kind of clarity, and you can look back on what was illegible that has become legible. But with my practice, I kind of love the space of like, yes, there are translations, but they're not direct. They're not like one-to-one. You don't get satisfied to know exactness, or maybe it's totally satisfying to not get exactness. So, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So, as someone who's very familiar with Miss Williams's work, and then
That's
having
my niece.
seen,
Oh, awesome.
I had a couple questions. One, I wanted to ask if you could expand more on how, I guess, your friendship maybe has appeared in each other's work and influenced each other's art. You both kind of spoke about, or Auntie Amanda had spoken about, getting those 12 minutes of conversation in wherever you can. And I'm curious about those conversations. And my second question was also, was separate, but you both had all spoken of like how having children had changed your artistic process because you had to. And so, yeah, I was curious about how maybe how that's appeared in both of your lives as well. Yeah.
So I don't know if our work is influenced. I mean, there's so many overlaps, but I don't think we have anything explicitly that we've like sat down to think through.
Not yet, no.
Not yet. But as you were talking, though, I was really thinking about what would it mean to actually design the space and build the space that the work would go in. So right now you are always responding to and maybe making some adjustments in existing architecture, but what would it mean? What would it mean for us to, I can design the space and then you make the things that go in the space. I mean, that to me is like the next scale up maybe of like what the work looks like.
Well, it sounds like we would need a conversation. And that's what we've been really good at lately. I feel like we can talk nonstop about 1,000 subjects, and we never
In 5 minutes.
And we don't have enough time ever. So it has
Our cab ride up here was like the longest time we've had uninterrupted
Yes.
conversation. But I think that we are just at a similar moment in terms of understanding time in a certain way. So I think that, not that motherhood is not great and children are not wonderful, but I think that artists across the spectrum have these ways where they have relationships to time. So maybe you're hyper aware because now you have to care for this other human, but people who are caregivers to their parents, or people who have to take medication to concentrate and they can't, or have to travel long distances, or have 2 jobs, or work at, like there's ways that we're all not conscious of how we have to manage that. There's just a kind of romanticization, and there's a luxury that many of us as contemporaries who've had formal education just get to hang out at college all day and like think about one idea for 2 weeks or what, it's like, and then the world hits and you're like, oh, you can't, you can't. And then some of our colleagues have the luxury of being able to do that into their practices, or they form practices to allow that kind of solitude. So I think, at least for me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but so the process just has to adjust to whatever's happening right now.
That's right.
And children was just so interesting in that. And we were actually joking yesterday that our two youngest are like so on point that they're going to be our studio assistants. Like so somehow they've grown up watching this, and you try not to impart, at least I do, try not to impart this kind of like OCD, anxiety-inducing pace of things, but they understand the kind of reality because their parents are artists, or, you know, my husband's an athlete, but he kind of performs in a certain way. It's just regular, so they think about creativity or productivity in a kind of way. So it's been interesting to see what impact that could potentially have. They go from like not caring, and you have to keep them alive, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Can I finish your painting? Can I give the title to it? Can I, you know?" And then you realize that they are absorbing these kinds of elements. I don't know if that's true for you. Like I don't know that they've shifted. You know, like it's a kind of misnomer to feel like your life is over. The kids have ruined everything. I think there's so many of us that adapt to time. I mean, it's true. People talk about kids like that in a way that's like, if you've crafted your life, your studios in your home, my husband and I were very intentional. If it's just part of your life, it's their life. They don't know any better, you know, and so you just adjust to what that looks like. Is that okay, Skylar?
That was a great answer.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Who was once my assistant in Oakland when she was 9. So see, you already knew the answer.
I have known you both for a while. And
Chicago.
I was going to be here, but you didn't text me back. But that's... Caroline, I've been looking at your work for a long time, and I've loved it. And I remember going to the show, I think it was 2022, at MCA, and I remember, I didn't know that the work was Nate's, but I remember looking and thinking they must be influencing each other. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until today that I saw the canvases on wood that I saw that was something that you had been doing for a very long time. And I'd never thought about your work. I thought, it's not the same, but I thought about Matisse, and I thought it being very flat and black. And now I'm looking at it, and I see, because, Amanda, you said the black, that it's actually coming out at us. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if that's the way you're seeing it. I just had no idea this three-dimensionality. I've been looking at them for years. And I don't know if there's something that you can talk about, but I don't know, it was a realization for me.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. You know, when I started off, I feel like I reversed the process. I started with these large three-dimensional objects that I wanted to treat as paintings. And then I went all the way back and started really like dealing with cut paper. Like you can't get any flatter than paper, it seems. And then, but the black did provide something. I had been making paintings, but during that time of 7 years, I think I had a painting crisis. And I really had to ask myself, what do I think is at stake for me to continue painting? You know, what do I think is of value? What do I think I have to say? And that's when I kind of thought, I want to go back to this very elemental forms and think about how can I find a voice of my own into very sometimes recognizable, unrecognizable shapes. And so I found it in the nuance and in these subtle shifts. So sometimes those subtle shifts will happen when a shape that I'm working with looks like a this or a that, but maybe in between, maybe a hybrid form. It's on the verge of becoming something else and living in between these two lives. And I think about the materiality from the canvas, the subtle shift to move something out from a painting on the wall to a form that comes out from it, to a form that's then freestanding, and then into the space. And I think I'm interested in this kind of back and forth shift, always happening in some way. And I think it's challenging in the paintings, but it's really kind of encouraging to hear you talk about that it's out of the black, they're coming out, you know, underneath the surface or from deep within.
I don't know if that's on. I've never thought about it before this, which is why you should listen to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you you so much for your remarks. My question is kind of building out of two of the things you said. First being you're noting that an encounter with abstraction sort of inspired a thought about how could this artist be conveying something emotionally that I can really engage with? How could this sort of universal language be erupting out of something that feels more abstract? And then your note of appreciation about fiction and stories of imagination that can provide a sort of license to think more broadly and maybe elaborate more creatively. And my question is related to those 2 points, which is, do you see aspects of your work to be related to world building, as in for viewers who encounter your work? And maybe the distinction doesn't matter, but as a writer, I'm always curious as to how artists think of where their world exists. If it maybe starts in a world that germinates from the seed in their own brain, or they kind of encounter it as a sort of map as they move through a lived or built environment.
I mean, when you say world building, it makes me think of a creation of something that didn't exist before, and potentially, or maybe something out of a ruin that can come to be in a new way. And I don't know if I didn't set out to think about creating a whole world. I feel like that over time, an environment gets built or responded to in my practice. And so, you know, I remember having a conversation with a friend a few years ago and thinking, like, he's like, you know, you've created the language and the objects, and next come the people. And I mean, it does sound like a world in that regard, you know, you get your own language, you have a people, and that way. But I think what I like about the practice and where it might not be so close to world building as to a language that gets to kind of shift every time the framework changes. So maybe world is a small W, and there is a kind of world that can be encountered in an exhibition, but I think ultimately it's the language that gets to shapeshift through these different scenarios. Thank you for your question.
Hi, my name is Sareem, and this comes as a virtual question from Christopher. Christopher, who is watching virtually, would like to know, how do you feel your teaching practices have influenced your work, or how do you think about your work?
Thank you, Christopher. I love that Christopher's bringing up teaching, because I teach full-time at Northwestern University, and so it plays a large role in my life. I think about my students often, and I think that there isn't maybe a direct one-to-one where the students are impacting the choices or decisions I'm making when I'm painting, but I will say that I am very aware of what happens in my studio and the kind of conversations I'm having, and the things that happen because of my practice are something that I kind of hold up to my students in a way of integrity, like this is what I'm grappling with, this is what I think about, this is what I've struggled with, this is what I haven't resolved, and that there is a kind of honesty that is provoked through my relationship with my students that I will share with them. And so that's the most impact I feel that has been the most rich back and forth with my students, who I hope some are watching tonight, if they're out there, if they're good students. I'm joking. But no, there's a lot of things I get. It's a rich experience having students. It's great.
Any more questions? Okay, I have one last question.
Uh-oh.
It's actually when you were just talking, have you ever thought about film? Like you talked so much about watching these films with your grandmother, and we've seen performance, we've talked about architecture, but is that a medium, or is that something you've also kind of thought through in relationship to these kinds of fictions that you're making?
It's a great question for two reasons. One, because I'd love to bring that into the conversation some. And then two, the great thing about being an artist is that when you have the inclination to do something, you can do it. It's like, that feels great. It feels like I have time to do that. There doesn't seem to be a rush. And I have thought about it, but I have thought about it for like 10 years, but it hasn't yet maybe unfolded, but I have an opportunity to give a performative lecture coming up at the Queen's Museum, and I've decided to do this with a very good friend of mine. And Rini Yanmatea is as a filmmaker and an artist, and we've had a long friendship, and there's something about working with another artist who's a friend and also moving into a new space of film, which I'm not as familiar with. But it's exciting because it's an opportunity to figure out some new things, to expand the way I work, and also to see like what can be produced in generative about working with a friend and having a friendship with all its own nuances of learning. I really think it's about expanding the way that I can understand how to work. And I'm excited. And I don't know how that's going to play out with film. We both don't know. I'm excited, but I think it'll have elements of film in it.
So I think that's a great full circle moment about expanses of time that you really felt were generated from our kind of Midwestern upbringing, and kind of taking the time necessary to move in whatever directions that you want. So I'm excited for that. So I think we'll close that out. I had promised Caroline I was going to embarrass her with a song, but I left my phone downstairs.
Oh, I'm certain someone
So I'll just sing the last. I won't sing.
Oh my, okay.
But when you said the Midwest was so important to you, I immediately thought of Laverne and Shirley. So I want you to know that we're going to make it anyway. Yes. Do it our own way. No, we're not going to sing. But I just want to thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to be in dialogue with you. This was so
great.
Precious and meaningful.
Wonderful.
Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Caroline, Amanda, thank you so much for drawing us into this incredible conversation between two friends. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for choosing to spend this time with us. If you enjoyed this program and want to hear more critical dialogues on Black art and culture, please consider contributing to the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund. More information can be found on the Studio Museum's website, and the link can be found on screen and in the chat. Wishing you all safe travels home. Thank you so much. Good night.